Preaching about the importance of AA games in the context of a AAA industry strangled by iterations and remakes has become a cliché on its own. So I'm not gonna do that. The last 10 years have seen the AA and indie markets brimming with more experimental and creatively fresh titles than one could reasonably play in a lifetime. And as a result, we've reached a point where we take games like Vampyr for granted. And we shouldn't. The truth is, AA games don't exist in a void. Their existence is dependent on the same market dynamics that leads a, say, EA executive to order the cancellation of a beloved series because it didn't meet its quarterly sales targets. And yet AA studios continue to put out games with ambitious niche concepts that mainstream titles don't dare touch, striving to achieve the same level of quality with half the budget and staff of a AAA studio. And more often than not failing. Now, I have to point out that this is not a dodgy attempt at painting the AA industry as some sort of folk hero that defies conventions and fights for your right to play janky games, nor is it a condemnation of the AAA industry. But you have to admit that there's something inherently romantic behind the idea of a small studio aiming high while knowing full well they'll get burned. And that basically describes Vampyr. A highly ambitious title brought to us by the same studio behind Life is Strange, and the lesser known but equally ambitious Remember Me.
This is absolute madness. I've lost touch with the real.
So Vampyr kicks off with a monologue so cheesy that it makes me wonder if it wasn't submitted to the Bulwer Lytton Fiction Contest first and then included in the game after being rejected.
New questions flourished as old answers withered. What is darkness but lurking sun? What is wall but enslaved stone? What is glass but tortured sand?
What is wall but enslaved stone? What is glass but tortured sand? Man, somebody must have spent too much time on Victorian Tumblr. That monologue reads like the angsty blog posts I used to write in high school with Porcupine Tree blasting in the background. It was a time in my life when I thought DC skate shoes were hot shit and that philosophy was a viable career path. You wouldn't get it, Dad, fuck off. Anyway, I'm sure this intro alone was responsible for hundreds of bad first impressions. But as hammy as the writing can be sometimes, Vampyr gets away with it for reasons which I'll explain a bit later. So after binging Zeitgeist and telling his poser dad to fuck off, Jonathan the playable character wakes up in a mass grave as a freshly embraced vampire. Not 5 minutes had passed since having gotten the suck that he gave the suck to his sister, who just happened to be there. But no time to mourn as our boy Jonathan is immediately pursued by vampire hunters. Here players get their first taste of the combat as our homie Jonathan slays his way through waves of Cockney accented goons and apologizes like the good boy he is. He finally manages to escape the vampire hunters by hiding into the first house he sees. Cue the obligatory war flashback as he picks up a conveniently placed gun and, realizing that Weezer will never release a good album during his lifetime, Jonathan decides to eat himself. Oh, you want me to do it? Okay. Now, despite what you might think, I like the intro. It's short, impactful, and does a great job of setting the tone and the mood. Unlike Vampire Bloodlines, Vampyr takes its setting very seriously. Its tone is bleak and depressing, and apart from the odd reference to vampire media, playful, self-aware jokes are few and far between. Vampyr makes no attempt at subverting the tropes it has so clearly drawn inspiration from. It wears its gothic influences as a badge of honor, and the game is better for it. The last 10 years have seen an influx of media, be it books or films or TV shows, that try so hard to be clever by focusing their energy on trope subversion and self-referential humor instead of storytelling. Some do it better than the others, but the result is often silly and quite frankly cringe-inducing. As if the writers are constantly screaming, "Hey, we get it, we're totally in on the joke. You thought he was just a boring investment banker, but he likes Brockhampton. We're so clever." So it's refreshing seeing a game that fully embraces its influences. And this is why Vampyr gets away with the occasionally hammy writing, because it fits the setting and the world. And what the world it is, man.
Using funny jokes about me and my boys, are you? Fuck. You must have some balls.
The story takes place in 1918 London, in the aftermath of the First World War. Jonathan Reed, a veteran combat medic, returns from the war only to see his hometown ravaged by a deadly strain of influenza. Wait a second. Oh shit. What the fuck? You gotta be kidding me. As if the economic decline following the war and the plague were not enough, London is also home to a plethora of supernatural beings. Well, a plethora is kind of an overstatement. While the existence of other monsters such as werewolves and ghosts are hinted at, only vampires and their degenerate offspring are featured. Speaking of vampires, sorry, icons. The writers put a lot of thought and effort into fleshing out their lore and society. Let me tell you, if you like the vampire politics of bloodlines, this game is for you. Take the Ascalon Club for example. The Ascalon Club is a secret society of rich and influential individuals, both vampire and mortals, that's been secretly guiding the course of the British Empire for the last 100 years. The club's leader, Lord Redgrave, is an ancient vampire who was presumably sired by none other than William Marshall. So basically, the Ascalon Club is the Vampire Illuminati. You also get to witness their initiation ritual and interrogate some of its members about the club's history. I don't know, there's something so fascinating about the secret society of uptight British vampires influencing opium tariffs while sipping tea. Or smelling it, because according to Lady Ashbury, tea gives vampires the shits. Or at least that's how I took it. Moving on, I can't speak for the authenticity of the Victorian elements because I'm not super familiar with Victorian settings. But there is one thing that took me by surprise, and in a pleasant way. So, in Whitechapel you encounter a small community of Romanian immigrants. Now, as a half Romanian myself, I'm so used to lazy depictions of Romanians in the media that I don't even bother pointing out the inaccuracies anymore. Usually writers just give their Romanian characters basic Russian names and thick accents and call it a day. Or thick eyebrows if they're feeling especially creative that day. Vampyr doesn't do that. Donut did their research and they went beyond just giving their Romanian characters authentic names. All the references and locations are spot on. What you see now on the screen is actual Romanian. The syntax and the flow are reminiscent of modern Romanian, but it's clear that the writers did their best to make it sound like an old-timey ad. And it's this attention to detail that makes Vampyr's setting so believable and absorbing. And this extends to the presentation as well. Vampyr may not be a great-looking game by conventional standards, but the art direction is spot on. The art style was inspired by the works of Philip Hale, an American figurative painter and probably one of the most influential artists that I've just found... fuck. As for the environments themselves, Donut took the Arcane Games approach and traveled to London to take photographs. Since the London of today looks quite different on account of being largely rebuilt and gentrified, they had to consult documentaries and history books. And as I suspected, the writers turned to the Knick for medical information. However, I'd go as far as to say that they've taken more from the Knick than the medical stuff. I'll get back to this later. Anyway, plague-ridden London looks as oppressive and disgusting as you might expect. Streets are littered with trash, walls are sprayed with ominous graffiti. It really sells the idea that everything has gone to shit. I especially like the look of Whitechapel with its dark alleyways, rundown houses and filthy ghettos. Even the upscale neighborhood of West End hasn't been spared. I was expecting the game to establish a contrast between the poor and rich neighborhoods, but no, the rich have it almost as bad as the regular citizens. Well, except our boy Jonathan, his house is immaculate. I also have to mention the atmosphere. Rarely have I played a game with an atmosphere as absorbing as Vampyr's. The soundtrack is, simply put, amazing. Even with its gothic aesthetic, I don't think Vampyr would have been as atmospheric as it is without the soundtrack. The soundtrack features an eclectic mix of cello pieces and electronic music. Also, electronic music and Victorian early 20th century settings make for a surprisingly appealing blend. Let's have a listen.
I have a common objective, but I require...
I think someone is eavesdropping.
Are you certain? You might as well come in, whoever you are.
Slowly, vampire. Who are you?
I mean you no harm.
Saith the vampire. Present yourself.
It's locked.
Remember when I said that Donald took more from the Knick than medical information? Not everything about the presentation is high quality though. The facial animations are robotic, bordering on uncanny. Some characters also do this weird shuffle, as if they were about to take the wickedest shit of their lives before you approached them and they're barely holding it in. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have been more forgiving towards the poor facial animations and even the Victorian diarrhea shuffle. But since talking to NPCs is such an integral part of the gameplay, more effort and time should have been invested in making them look and act like human beings. And as you'll see, you'll be doing a lot of talking. Now, as for Jonathan himself, he is portrayed as a stock, highly educated English gentleman whose mild-mannered demeanor clashes with his newfound bestial nature that urges him to kill innocents for sustenance. I say innocents with a big asterisk because nobody is who they seem to be. There are over 60 NPCs in the game, each with their own backstories and social circles, and I have to say that they're written and voiced quite well. By studying your target's habits, doing side quests and even exploring, you collect hints. These hints serve both a narrative and a mechanical purpose. Hints unlock additional dialogue choices, which John can press to find out more background information about NPCs. And some of those hints can reveal some pretty morally shady activities. For instance, most people's first instinct would be to empathize with Nurse Pippa's pessimism and disillusionment with her job, given the death and suffering she has to witness every day. But dig deeper and you'll find out that she's been actively profiting off of the epidemic by booking hospital beds for those who can pay. Not only that, but her boyfriend Milton, the ambulance driver, demands fees for transporting people to the hospital. So, to recap, we have two hospital employees effectively running an extortion racket in the midst of a historic epidemic. And that's just the first 2 hours of the game. Another great example is Joe Peterson. You can find him in the rundown district of Whitechapel harassing people and demanding protection money. He's a member of the Wet Boot Boys gang, and all in all an unquestionable piece of shit. But, and you know this was coming, there's a reason why he joined the gang. What's important to note here is that all of this stuff is optional, but there's a catch. You see, killing mobs and advancing the story will only give you so much XP. Sucking people dry, on the other hand, will give you massive amounts of XP. And unlike Vampire Bloodlines, there's no pacifist way to do it. Now, the interesting part about this is that the more you learn about a person, the more XP you'll get from their blood. But here's the issue. Say someone gives you a very bad first impression, and you go, alright, I'm gonna go do some detective work, and as soon as I get my mesmerize level high enough, you're done. But dig deep enough and you might actually end up liking or at least sympathizing with them. You see, nobody really deserves to be eaten because most of the citizens have at least one redeemable quality. Except this guy. Fuck him. And that's the big dilemma Vampyr proposes. Should I kill this totally innocent person for a huge chunk of XP, or try to hold my bestial nature in check and make my life harder as a result? It goes even further than that though. Each district has a health meter. The more people you kill, the sicker its inhabitants will get. Once it plunges to critical, all hell breaks loose. People start missing and dying left and right, and all manner of shit starts happening. The logic behind this system is to simulate a sort of social ecosystem, wherein each member of the community serves a specific role in the functioning of the district. Or at least that's what I think. Take the bar owner for instance. Tom's bar is on neutral territory, and as a reformed gang member himself, the other gangs respect him enough to not cause trouble in the area. Now, if I were to kill him, well, you can probably imagine what would happen. It's a really interesting system and I wish other games would give it a spin. Its potential is massive. Doing some good old-fashioned social engineering by sucking people dry never gets boring. It's not without its problems though. For one, apart from a few key story moments, your decisions don't matter as much as you'd think. To be fair to the game, there is some reactivity to player decisions, which I'm not gonna spoil, but it mostly amounts to watching a district's health status changing after resting. So, if you feel like going on a rampage like I did, just go for it, man. Wait. Okay, now we're good.
My son. Who will take care of him? Was I a good father?
Good evening, Harry. May I come in? Sure.
Speaking of which, the only way to improve a district's health status is by curing NPCs. I was really excited to play as a vampire doctor because the duality between healer and predator has the potential to cause some very interesting moral dilemmas. Sadly, its implementation is shallow at best. You cure people by crafting medicine and forcing them to take it via mind control. This sounds fine, right? Well, there are over 60 NPCs, and with no fast travel option, you'll often have to travel from one end of the map to the next just to give some fucker his pills. Finally, the store page advertises that you can beat the game without killing a single NPC. That's true. Technically true. But here's the thing, by taking the pacifist route, you'll be depriving yourself of precious XP and abilities, and you'll have a hard time in combat. Well, that's fine. That's the point, right? But the only way to get a good ending is to spare everybody. Everybody! This doesn't make any sense. So you're telling me that the world's gone to shit because I killed some asshole by the docks? Sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? So let's recap. If you want to stand a chance in combat, you have to kill civilians. But to get a good ending, you have to ignore the game's most interesting mechanic. Before we move on to the last section of the video, I want to make one thing clear. Even though I've been complaining for the last god knows how many minutes, I respect the hell out of Dontnod for what they try to do here. It's a cool but deeply flawed system, the likes of which has never been seen in this industry. I really hope they'll give it another go in the future, because it would be a shame if they shelved it. So the only things left to talk about are the combat and the level design, and they have problems too.
Have you ever killed one of these creatures? Yourself, I mean.
Of course I have. What kind of question is that?
In essence, Vampyr is an action RPG in the style of The Witcher 3, with a little bit of Dark Souls sprinkled on top. I know comparison is the lazy reviewer's tool, but I really don't know how else to describe it. So let's start with the skill tree. In Vampyr there are no character stats to improve. Instead, you purchase and upgrade abilities as you gain XP points. As I've mentioned before, XP points are awarded when players complete quests, kill mobs, or suck people dry, with the latter providing the largest amount. The skill tree is absolutely massive. If you like chunky skill trees, you'll have a blast with Vampyr, as all abilities have sub-branches and ranks. Abilities can be active, passive, offensive and defensive, and the players are encouraged to experiment and look for synergies. What's more, Dontnod were gracious enough to cater to those of us who suffer from FOMO by including the option to respec at any time. Then there's the Mesmerize ability. Each NPC has a certain Mesmerize level, and to embrace them, yours has to match it. This is the only ability that players have no direct control over, as it's instead tied to story progress. This was probably a design decision taken to prevent players from dumping points into it early and breaking the game, which makes sense since Vampyr is narrative driven. The combat is functional, if not a bit prone to exploits. The combat loop basically boils down to locking on, dodging around an enemy, and giving it the old Jonathan Reed treatment. Those familiar with the resource-based combat of something like Nioh or Dark Souls will have no issues getting the hang of Vampyr's mechanics. You spend blood to power your vampiric abilities, stamina to dodge, stun and attack enemies, and health to, well, not die. What's interesting is that the blood that you expend during combat to cast abilities and the blood that's used for upgrading them are two different resources. The combat variant of blood acts a bit like vampiric mana, which can be replenished by feeding on enemies. But to feed on enemies, you need to stun them. So just by virtue of this simple mechanic, the combat turns into this very elegant loop of dodging, striking, casting vampiric abilities, followed by stunning an enemy so you can give it a suck and rinse rinse and repeat. Occasionally you'll need to adapt your tactics according to the enemy you're facing. By activating John's vampiric senses, you'll notice that enemies have resistances or weaknesses to certain damage types. This is a great way to encourage players to switch things up and approach encounters on a case-by-case basis. Enemy types are varied enough to keep things fresh even late into the campaign. However, things become truly interesting when you start fighting vampires with the same abilities as your own. Unlike Dishonored, where the combat system starts crumbling under its own weight once the game introduces enemies with supernatural powers, Vampyr seems perfectly apt at handling vampire versus vampire fights. Which makes me wonder why they didn't focus more on this. There are only so many cockney vampire hunters and skalds I can tolerate, or hobo vampires as I like to call them. The game offers a decent variety of weapons, from swords, axes to daggers and even pistols and shotguns. But no matter how hard I tried mixing and matching, it was just too easy upgrading my trusty two-handed club via the game's rudimentary crafting system and just sticking with it. One problem that most action RPGs suffer from is excessive padding, and Vampyr is no exception. Enemies respawn after resting, and the combat is simply not deep enough to make the repetition tolerable. Then there's the level design. Oh man. Vampyr features a semi-open world design that, while obviously a product of the studio's limited budget, can still feel overly restrictive at times. Despite being a vampire of ancient lineage, Jonathan can't jump over fences, so I hope you liked cramped alleyways and side streets, cause you'll be taking a lot of detours through them.
This is despicable.
Vampyr is a very intriguing game with a great concept that the developers simply didn't have the budget and the experience to implement properly. And still, I recommend this game without any caveats. In my pre-review, I stated that I'd like to see more studios explore niche concepts and mechanics rather than iterating on old formulas, and I stand by that. So please, give Vampyr a shot. It's well worth your time. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and if you wanna say hi, you can find me on Twitter. I'll see you next time.